Good morning, Zoom folks.
Good morning.
Yeah, Oliver, sorry, I was gonna send a reminder email and I blanked on sending it. So yes, we are back in class. It's okay if you're on Zoom today, that's fine. Alrighty, I'm hoping more people will either log on or come to class, but yes, for the foreseeable future, we will be here. Woo! So, yeah, glad to be back. Good to see everybody. And I just keep telling myself, I'm here, it's good. All right, so a couple things coming up. So today we're gonna finish the lecture discussion on chapter 7, or actually it's chapter 4, Virgil 7. And then we're going to do chapter 5. We'll start that today. Your next exam is Monday. So tonight or tomorrow morning, I will put together a review sheet, post it on Blackboard, email it to y'all too, so that you have that information when you need it. Hey, come on in. I think some people forgot about that first. So it'll be the exact same format as last time in terms of anybody who signed on. In terms of the matching to start, and then short answers about scenarios. So again, I'll make up a review sheet so you know exactly what to study over the weekend. Hey, and we actually get to be in class. Hooray, hooray. It will actually be on paper. It's a novel concept. Yeah, it'll be on paper. You don't need to bring your laptop or anything. And same thing as before, where there'll be multiple questions to respond to each scenario. Other things you have coming up due a week from Friday is your outline for your poster that you'll be doing for the end of the semester. The syllabus has details on what I'm looking at on that. There are some people who haven't turned in their topics yet, so make sure you've got a good topic going. I went through just to give accurate to the moment midterm progress reports and put in zeros for missing things. But if you want to still turn them in, you can. Okay, so again, my policy is basically till the day of our exam, you can turn stuff in at the end of the semester. So make sure that you do that. Yes, test is next Monday, the 18th. I'm glad y'all are helping each other out in the chat. That's nice. So I will replace those zeros, I guess is what I'm saying. So don't freak out too much. If you're like, oh, my grade doesn't look as good as I want. I think in this class, people were not doing as poorly as some of my other classes, where people just haven't turned anything in. Alrighty. So we'll dive right on back in. So if you remember, we're talking about numbers. There we go. Just to get it out of our way. And sort of what numbers will you encounter, and in what scenarios will you encounter them, and what did those mean? We'll finish up this section, and then we start talking about numbers more in the next section. So again, our approach to this with this new class is vast majority of you probably won't have to use stats in your, work going forward if you're not going to be a research scientist, right? But we would love for you to understand what these numbers mean when you run into them. So some of these are stuff that you've probably known since like middle school, right? So mean, the average, right? You add up all the numbers and divide it by the number of data points you have. The median is the middlemost number of your data set, or the average of the two middlemost if you have an even number of people. Outliers are something we need to spend a couple minutes talking about, because they are the people who, oftentimes outliers are people who just like didn't pay attention when they were answering a questionnaire, for example, or people who might just for some reason be really high or really low on a variable. A lot of times we are going to look at these and eliminate these people from our data set, just because, again, a lot of times when we look, it'll be that this person clearly wasn't paying attention, right? They've all answered items that are like written in the opposite direction with the exact same score, things like that. So the folks at either end of those extremes, if we think about a normal curve, right, a bell curve, are the things we want to look at, because they can skew our data. They can give us not accurate results, or even hide significant relationships we might find. So oftentimes we're looking at true extremes. So we're looking at people who are 2 or 3 standard deviations above or below the mean. So these are true outliers, or again, people who just weren't paying attention. I'll give you an example. So sometimes I collect data on Amazon's platform called Mechanical Turk. And I've learned pretty quickly, I have to be really specific when I ask for things like someone's weight. Because if I'm looking for pounds and someone reports it in kilograms or stone, right? It'll look like, how does this person weigh so many pounds? Like a person shouldn't weigh that many pounds, right? Or it'll look like stone, someone might weigh like 7 stone, right? So you're like, how is this person an infant? Literally, like how do they weigh 7 pounds? Right? So those you would eliminate just because, again, probably not having a 7-pound infant answering to your questionnaire, right? Then standard deviation is a measure of variability. That's basically, you take each score in your data set and you compare it to the mean. So mathematically, what you're doing is subtracting the mean from each score. And then you square that, and then you find an average of that, and then you take the square root of that. You're not going to have to calculate this, but basically what you need to know about standard deviation is a way to say how much variability is in your data, okay? So if you have a pretty small standard deviation, that's usually a pretty good indicator everyone's sort of clustering around the mean. If your standard deviation is huge, right, that means there's just a lot of variability, and sometimes that happens naturally. So if we think of something like height, and we took all the people in the world, right? Well, yeah, you have a lot of people who are sort of falling between 5 foot and 6'2", right? But then you have like your Simone Bileses and your Shaquille O'Neals, right? And so you're going to have a lot of big standard deviation just because people naturally occur in this wide amount of variability. So how can you avoid being scared by numbers? And I don't really have anything here, but I just wanted to throw it to y'all, or I'll open the chat for anyone online. What sort of things have helped you all in the past to not freak out when you have a math class or you have to like interpret numbers? That's huge. Yeah, especially if you're calculating it out, literally taking it one step at a time, right? Working it through, definitely. Yeah. Repetition, lots of practice, Debbie says in the chat, yeah. I mean, for me, honestly, it was figuring out, this is gonna sound really trite, so forgive me, people who really like math, including my husband. It was figuring out why we do what we do. Like, why do we care about these numbers? And so for me, it was taking psych stats, like realizing like, oh, by knowing how to analyze these numbers, it tells us information that we want to know, right? So sometimes things like that can be helpful. Yeah, the why is a big piece of it. There are people who think about the why in a different way, right? Theoretical mathematicians who are coming up with really abstract forms of math and solving these equations. And that's motivating for them. And that's great. But that's never going to be me, right? So give me the numbers that will actually help me answer the question. Yeah, considering perspective can be really helpful as well. So I would say one of the more common things I've seen among students in general, but psych majors in particular, is the idea of like anytime I mention math, people kind of freezing out, right? So just think about it as, what do these numbers tell us that we wouldn't be able to figure out otherwise? Can be a really helpful way to do that. All right, probability is something that's mentioned in both of the chapters that we're talking about from last week and this week. So it's essentially just the likelihood something will happen, and you can do it mathematically. So if you have a probability of 1, it's definitely going to occur. If you have a probability of 0, it definitely won't occur. As you probably guess, most probabilities fall in the middle there. And for really abstract things, it can be really hard to figure out what the probability actually is, right? So if we're trying to figure out the probability that someone will do well on a test, right? We've got to not only think about like how many hours they studied, but like, have they been going to class? Have they been able to pay attention in class? Is the professor engaging them? Does the material make sense to them? Have they learned some of it before? Did they get a good night's sleep the night before, right? Did something horrible happen on campus and they had to attend to that? Like one of my worst examples when I was in college wasn't a test, I had a paper due, and it was like a snowy day. I went to college in Ohio, so those were more common. And so we had like a choir concert, but it was with other choirs, and because of the snow, they were late. So that already put me behind. My best friend had been driving back and her car flipped. She was okay, but like obviously freaking out. So I went over to her room and I'm literally like picking glass out of her hair. And then like just when I think I've gotten her calmed down and I'm like good to go, another friend shows up and it's like, I'm really freaked out this happened to me. And I was just like, you know what? Just go to sleep. I'm gonna write this paper. Just sleep on my floor. That's fine. You know, and so things like that will happen. And then it turned out because of the snow, our professor couldn't get in and we had an extension on the paper anyway. Of course. But it didn't mean I got to proofread it. So that probability I would have never been able to sit and figure out, right? So what we can do in psychology is just get our best estimates of what that probability might be. Alrighty, so I have a video about stats in psych. And one thing I should tell you all, to be transparent, is I've been trying really hard to find videos that include not just who we typically pick up when we think people talk about stats, so like middle-aged white guys, right? And so I'm finding some really great ones from scholars of color and female scholars, and so I'll keep trying to share those with you. So. Yeah. Wake up. Good morning, speakers.
Hello, I'm Dr. Keon West from the Institute of Psychological Sciences at the University of Leeds, and I'm here to talk to you about the importance of statistics. It's very rare that statistics happens to be anyone's favorite part of studying psychology, or any other science for that matter. Statistics can be complicated, they can be confusing.
One thing I will say is there are psych stats people who get like really deeply into this, and they move our field forward with what we're able to analyze, and that's awesome. But again, never going to be me.
They can be difficult, and often they're just not that interesting, at least not for many of our students. But statistics are still very important, and I'm going to try and explain to you why they're very important and why they're in fact essential to conducting this kind of scientific investigation. Suppose you had a question. Any kind of question would do. Let's say that you wanted to know whether or not men were taller than women. How would you go about figuring that out? Now, the immediate thing would be to say, well, I could go out and measure the height of a man and then measure the height of a woman and see if the man is taller than the woman. And if that works, then you could say that men are taller than women, right? Well, no, wrong. Because there's many reasons why that's a very bad way of handling it. You could measure a particularly tall man and a particularly short woman. So you could, in this instance, find that one man is taller than one woman. But if you had measured two other randomly selected people, it's possible that you would have found that the woman was taller than the man. And then you'd have a different result. Okay, then you'd say, what do we do in this case? Maybe we should measure multiple people. You could go around measuring groups of men and groups of women, and then you could compare them. But how would you do that? Would you tick a box every time a man was taller than a woman and tick another every time a woman was taller than a man? And then I guarantee you, even if you went through a very rigorous system of measuring people, if you gather any two groups of people together, even randomly selected, you will find that their heights are different, because human beings vary in height. And so what you need to know is this difference in height a real difference, or just an illusory random difference that happens to crop up? Let's say you had another question. Do students who study more do better at exams? We're not assuming any direction. We're just looking. Do students who study more do better at exams? How would you check that? You could find one student, and you could say, well, this student, she studies very hard, but she doesn't do particularly well. And maybe you find another random student, and he studies very little, but he does very well at his exams. Should you then conclude that, well, clearly studying actually doesn't do much for your exams, or doesn't make much of a difference? Well, of course you can't. Because if you had selected two other students quite at random, then you might have found that actually this student studies very little and does very poorly. And the other student, why, she studies a lot and does very well. But even then, we're not sure. We can't tell if this is random or if it's fluctuating or if it's a real thing that actually is emerging from the data. You could measure a bunch of people, a number of students, but how many would be enough? And how much of a relationship would be enough? You could plot them on a graph, as I've done, and you would see that the students are moving from those who study very little and get very bad grades to those who study very much and get very good grades. So it looks like something is going on. But at what point can we declare that, yes, we've decided this is a real relationship and not just something that looks like a relationship? I'll ask you two more questions that are a bit more complicated and not as easily visually represented. One would be, how would you check whether exercise predicted exam results? This is not just whether there's a relationship between exercising and getting good grades. This is whether one variable predicts the other or explains the variance in the other. Or an even more complicated question, what if you wanted to know how exercising and going to parties influence exam results together? That's a bit of a tricky one to visualize, because it could just be that exercise predicts better grades and partying predicts better grades. Or they could interact with each other in some way, so that one predicts more and one predicts less, and that they balance each other out in some places and actually make each other stronger in other places. This is a very complicated question, and it's not that straightforward to get it into our heads, and it's definitely not that straightforward to check by simply putting data points on a graph. So if you have all these questions, you have some very specific questions about the data that you need to have answered before you can decide whether or not any of these relationships are real and whether or not any of these relationships are meaningful. You have questions like, how many data points do you need? At what point do you stop thinking it's just a fluke or random fluctuation and decide that it's an actual, stable difference that's emerging in the data? And how can you measure whether or not relationships between variables are strong or weak, and whether they go in one direction or in another direction? And if you understand the importance of getting these answers from the data, then you've understood the importance of statistics, because statistics is how we answer these questions. Statistics.
So he goes on for another 10 minutes. This is on your PowerPoint, so feel free to watch the rest. But I just wanted to get to like the why should we care bit of it, basically. And yeah, it allows us to answer these questions, and psychology in particular, it allows us to answer some pretty complex questions with the statistics we have. Again, nothing I'm going to teach you, or nothing honestly that I would probably teach in any undergrad statistics class, but we have multi-level modeling that lets us look at, let's say, schools in a school district, and then classrooms within those schools, and then students within those classrooms. We have statistical ways that let us look at all of that data together. We also have ways of essentially putting a whole bunch of variables in a diagram and seeing how they relate. Actually, my favorite program to use for this type of analysis, which is called structural equation modeling, literally lets you just draw the relationships. It's really cool. So again, numbers allow us to do what we need to do in science in general, but particularly in psychology. So I'm going to go ahead, if the Zoom menu will go away, and go to the lecture we're starting for today, which again is more about the numbers. So this is going to be talking about what the numbers do and do not tell you. So this is chapter 5, and it also talks about like calling this measurements, and we'll get a little bit into like measurement error and things like that. But more than anything, this is just a continuation of what we've just been talking about. So what can we tell from numbers, and in what cases should we maybe not draw certain conclusions? All right, so inferential statistics are based on the concepts of a population and a sample. Can anyone, again, either here in person or in the chat, tell me what the difference is between a population and a sample?
Population is like the big group that you're looking at. The sample are who you're actually getting data from.
Exactly, yeah. So population, like let's say theoretically we wanted to do the population of the United States, right? We'd want to like literally get every single person living in the United States. Even the census can't do that, right? And we don't have that much resources. So instead we're going to use a sample. Yeah, sample is the slice we're testing. I really like that way of phrasing it, Oliver. That this is, you know, a small way of looking at it. I'm just gonna, a couple more people signed on, so I'm just gonna take a sec to make sure I check them in here. Cool, good. So usually it's impossible to test the population. Even let's say here at Virginia Wesleyan, I have in the past sent out an all-student email to try to recruit for a study. And I might get like 100 people to take it, which is awesome, actually. That's a good sample for here. But, you know, that's not the 1,500 or 1,600 people we actually have on campus, right? So most of the time, just out of necessity, we have to use a sample. And a lot of times we will make efforts to try to make our samples representative. So trying to get, you know, diversity in terms of gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, even something like class year in college, right? That reflect our overall population here at Virginia Wesleyan. So inferential statistics allow us to use the information from a sample to try to generalize to the population. So to draw conclusions about the population based on the sample. And now, depending on the quality of our sample, like how representative it is, how many people we were able to get, how careful they are filling out the data, right? Sometimes this is true, and sometimes this is not true at all. Psychologists are sort of notorious for using convenient samples. Folks like yourselves, people on Zoom and people in the classroom, who would sign up through Arsona and take studies that way, right? Which is great because you're readily available, right? Oftentimes you can get extra credit for the studies, so it's win-win, right? But that means we're only looking at college students, right? So we're not looking at people beyond traditional college age most of the time. And honestly, college students may not even be totally representative of people in your age range, right? Like there might be something fundamentally different about people who choose not to or cannot go to college than people who can, right? The other problem, which fortunately we don't have as much at Wesleyan, but is that a lot of colleges and universities are super duper white. And when you get to the upper echelons where this like quality research comes from, we also often see people being more upper class or upper middle class, right? So now you have samples that are representing this really small segment of the population, and then we're trying to generalize to the population. And that can be problematic. Basically, what is happening when we say we can take our sample and generalize to the population, draw conclusions about the population? We're saying, if we just keep collecting data, like instead of getting 100 Wesleyan students, we got 200 or 300 or 500, we would come to the exact same conclusions. That like these relationships between the variables are going to hold up regardless. Alrighty, so a lot of times you will hear this term statistically significant. And so I have a pretty brief video to talk about what that actually means.
Let's assume John tells you he discovered a special dice rolling technique that enables him to roll a 6 more frequently than the average person. To prove it, he rolls a dice in front of you and it actually ends up being 6. However, it's not enough to impress you because it might simply be a matter of luck, as there's a 1 in 6 or roughly 16.7% chance of that happening regardless of which dice rolling technique you use. A researcher who wants to determine if John is right or wrong starts with a so-called null hypothesis, which states that no, there is no relationship between the technique you use and how often you roll a 6. In other words, you start by assuming that John is wrong. John hopes the null hypothesis will be rejected because it would mean it's very likely, even if not 100% certain, that he's right. He ultimately rolls the dice 1,000 times, and it lands on 6 in 20% of the cases, so higher than the previously mentioned 1 in 6 odds. Is this enough to negate the null hypothesis? Well, no, because we also have to determine whether the findings are statistically significant. To do this, we calculate the so-called p-value, which is a number between 0 and 1 that lots of applications easily generate for us based on the data we provide. Generally speaking, if the p-value is lower than 0.05, it's a good argument in favor of rejecting the null hypothesis and making John happy. In our case, we'll assume the p-value is 0.04, which is low enough to reject the null hypothesis and kind of like us saying John's 20% success rate is better than the standard 1 in 6 odds, but there's a 4% likelihood this only happened by chance. Therefore, while we cannot be 100% certain John's technique works, we can say that the lower the p-value is, the more certain we are. All in all, here's how things work. 1. Start with a null hypothesis. 2. Gather and interpret data. 3. Calculate the p-value to determine if your findings are statistically significant. 4. If your data supports John's claim and the p-value is lower than 0.05, you will reject the null hypothesis and John will be pleased.
John's got some moves. So yeah, basically this is a statistical way of saying it's pretty likely this didn't happen by chance.
Let's assume John...
So I kind of just told you what it means, as did John. But what does statistical significance not mean? What can we not say based on something being statistically significant? Yeah. What's that? Yeah, definitely. Remember, Dr. Morrow's least favorite word when we're talking about research, proof. We check it out the window. Yeah, it doesn't prove anything because it could just be John. It could be he's actually using a weighted die, right? There could be things going on. What else does it not mean if we say something is significant? Well, I think it's really common to think that because of our use of the word significant in everyday life, right, that means important, right? And sometimes we'll even sort of distinguish between statistical significance and what we call clinical significance, something that would like make a meaningful difference in that person's life. And so basically you can, especially if you have a lot of data, you can have a pretty small difference that's statistically significant. Example I often use is, let's say we've randomly assigned people to a brief intervention for depression. And our control group, their final score on a depression inventory is 35. And our intervention group, the people who got this new therapy, their depression score is 33.5. So it's lower, but like the cutoff for depression on this hypothetical scale is 30, right? So like, did that actually make a difference in their lives to be like 1.5 points less depressed? Maybe a little, but probably not in the way we would hope, right? We'd like to see a lot more change. But again, if we have a lot of people, and especially within those people, we have repeated measures. So we're measuring like before the intervention and after. It can happen that we have something that is statistically significant, that p-value is going to be where we want it, but in fact, it's sort of meaningless. So that's always important. I think as researchers, we forget this all the time, right? I'm working a research group right now that we, again, have a pretty big data set. I think there's like 450 people in it. And, we have things that are popping, like correlations that are in the 0.18 range that are significant, but it's like, does that actually mean anything, right? And one of my collaborators is really good at like pulling us back on that. And they're like, that's low, guys. Like, I don't know if we should really be like generalizing based on this, right? So, what does it mean? It means it's unlikely to have occurred by chance. That's essentially what we mean when we say something statistically significant. So again, we typically are using this p-value, the probability cutoff of 0.05. So we're looking for the p-value that honestly in this day and age, just like our stats program is going to spit out for us. It's very rare to calculate anything by hand, especially if you have massive data sets, right? We want that to be less than 0.05. And basically what that says is that there's a 95% chance this relationship actually exists. Those are pretty good odds, right? But there's still a 5% chance that this occurred by accident. And so why do we use this cutoff? It's kind of arbitrary, honestly. Like someone somewhere decided, like, we feel pretty comfortable if we're 95% confident this is right? And in fact, there is a sort of variability measure we use sometimes that is called the 95% confidence interval, for example. Some people will choose to be more stringent and use like a p is less than 0.01. That means there's less than a 1% chance this happened by chance. And in some cases, you will see p is less than 0.001, which means there's less than a 0.1% chance this occurred by accident. So again, there's a certain arbitrariness, but this gives us a general idea of, is the data coming together in such a way that it looks like there is a consistent relationship happening. So generalization, I've already talked about this a little bit, but let's think about specific samples, right? So what if we take a sample and we say, this applies to everybody everywhere. So if the sample was people on the internet, and we said, you know, people on the internet signed on, took a survey, then we said, yes, this applies to everybody. What problems could we run into? Who are we not capturing? And again, people in the chat, feel free to chime in too. Yeah, people who don't have access to the internet, which sounds a little crazy to us in this day and age, but it's still, especially in rural areas, right, very difficult to access the internet. I mean, silly example, but I stayed in an Airbnb with some friends once that was out in Western Virginia in a dip between the mountains. And not only did the house not have Wi-Fi, we had no cell signal. And that was like for a bunch of millennials, like, what, we can't look stuff up. But it was also free, right? But people who live in that area, right, might not have access. All right, and we talked a little bit about students and how they might not generalize, right? Let's think about students at specific institutions. So what about students from Harvard might make them different than the general population? Debbie also said people who can access the internet. Ooh. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in fact, sometimes in studies, parents' level of education, in particular for whatever reason, mother's level of education is used as a marker of socioeconomic status. But yeah, you have to have the luxury of being able to afford to go there, right? And to afford, you know, not to work or not to work as much while you're there. Yeah. Yeah, people of other age groups, I'd be saying, they're highly intelligent as well, one would hope, right? Does anyone know what Bob Jones University is? Okay, so Bob Jones University is like, it makes Regent and Liberty look liberal. Okay, so it's really conservative. There's a strict dress code where women have to wear dresses or skirts, and they have to be a certain length, you know, a lot of regulations about curfews and things like that. So if we had students from Bob Jones University and we said, oh, this is our sample, who are we missing then? Yeah, exactly. So we're missing the more liberal people. We're missing probably the non-religious people, right? And then the other side of that spectrum, again, if you're not familiar, one of the most liberal places in the country in terms of colleges is Oberlin College in Ohio. So they have like co-ed bathrooms and have for years, right? And like when I went to visit, there were guys wearing skirts. So we're going from Bob Jones where the women have to wear skirts, right? Too. And like this is not novel now, but it was in the 90s, right? When I was college visiting. And you know, they just have like a history, like they were involved in the Underground Railroad and things like that, right? And so yeah, then you're missing those Bob Jones people, right? You're missing the more conservative people who might not choose to go there. What if we're doing a study in animals and generalizing it to people? Like, yeah, right? So I think we're all just like, huh. So I have a couple of videos about this. One is more of a like, I think both of these on this page are more of a like pro animal usage. And then I think I have a more skeptical one after this.
We use animal models in our research because we can experiment with new treatments in animals before these treatments are really ready for the clinic. And we're able to then really get answers that we hope will allow us to take the information back to the clinic and come up with new and even better treatments.
We can't say whether something new is safe or whether it works unless it's gone through a proper set of tests. These tests actually have to begin at the level of animals, so it's very important to do that.
We're actually reproducing the cause of the disease in the animal model, and that is a tremendous advantage.
Fruit fly models, worm models, mouse models, rat models, you can tweak the system with genetics that you can't do in other systems. The reason we study these living systems is because they have the appropriate structure so that there's cells that talk to each other. There's different cell types within a given region. When you have it in a dish, it's much more difficult. You can look at a single cell type, but not necessarily the complexity that happens in the brain.
With an animal model, we can look for visible changes, microscopic changes, biochemical changes within the mice that would be impossible to do in a living human being, for instance, and would also be very difficult to do, say, in a tissue culture dish.
Many people who don't understand animal research will say, well, why don't you use computer models? Why don't you use cells growing in a dish? The problem with computer models is they have to model something. You have to understand the process before you can actually use a computer to further understand it.
We've made a great deal of progress in developing animal models for Alzheimer's disease, such that we can now take a human gene from families who have what's called familial Alzheimer's disease, where this amyloid protein's deposited in the brain. We can take the gene out of people, put it into a mouse, and those mice will develop that same protein in the brain as if the mice were developing Alzheimer's disease. We can develop various therapeutics, drugs, to try to remove that protein from the brain, or perhaps we can block it being deposited in the brain. All kinds of combination therapies can be tested in animals relatively quickly, and then we translate that into humans.
Think about this in terms of if this was your child, and what would you really need to see in terms of evidence before you're ready to try this experimental treatment in your child?
If we can demonstrate that the human nervous system works like the animals, it helps us to define treatments. And there's lots of things that we can study in animals that we can't in humans that give us the information that we need. What we can learn from the rodent models, we could never learn in the human being.
All right, so we get that. That is very obviously pro-animal science because it's all animal scientists. So.
There's a lot on the line when it comes to human social lives.
Real quick, I should give this one some context. I really like this one because it talks about how they're using animal models to study more of what we think of like social psych constructs that we think we can typically only study in humans.
So much, in fact, that a person's place on the social ladder might determine how long that person lives. Social adversity's effect on human health has surfaced in many studies, which show how income, social integration, and adverse childhood experiences are linked to lifespan and even the prevalence of specific diseases during life. A recent scientific review outlined these social risk factors, known as the social determinants of health, across years of research into humans. Using data collected from the literature, they plotted how men earning $35,000 or less at age 40 are expected to live fewer years than those earning $100,000 or more. A social integration composite based on marital status, frequency of social contacts, and community engagement showed least socially integrated women were more than twice as likely to suffer from stroke than the most integrated. And people who had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences were expected to die nearly 20 years earlier than those who experienced none.
So adverse childhood experiences are things like abuse, neglect, being through a traumatic experience in your neighborhood, things along those lines.
But what possibly set this review apart from others was that the authors compared human studies with those in several other groups of mammals. Rodents, horses, whales, and even hyraxes have been shown to exhibit important health outcomes that correlate with their social environment and relationships. Of course, other primates display similar patterns. One study found that male Assamese macaques who formed stronger social bonds with other males ascended the hierarchy and also fathered more young. And the literature review identifies a pathway in baboons in which social adversity, early life adversity, and mediators of those events forge a delicate interplay to affect health, fitness, and lifespan. But the scientists who tend to study these furry creatures often stand apart from the scientists who study social health factors in humans. The two scientific fields seemingly dig for the same results, but do so in parallel tunnels, which usually stand apart. As a consequence, these fields of study might be missing out on resources that could be game changers in understanding the social determinants of health, including its biological mechanisms in humans and behavioral or environmental mediators in other animals. The review hurled a monkey wrench into this structure, thrusting human social science into the fray with the study of animal behavior. Rather than viewing them as strict parallels, the review suggested combining them, hoping to reap the benefits of these isolated fields working in tandem. Future large-scale genomic studies could integrate research on social health factors to give a more complete picture of negative health effects in humans. Research on hierarchies could address whether climbing a social ladder benefits lifespan, or whether a more egalitarian community improves an individual's longevity. Ultimately, the review stresses that humans have a long history of dependence on the social environment, which, in evolutionary terms, may be older than our species itself. Insight into social stressors across the animal kingdom could help us tackle the greatest challenges in public health for years to come.
So there you see, again, some fun things we could do with comparisons, and most of these studies are not very invasive, right? So there are ways that you can do animal research without
There's a lot of
beating animals up, right? But I did want to share a video that talked about alternatives to animal testing, because again, some people, including our neighbors at PETA in downtown Norfolk, right? But also just people in general are uncomfortable with using animals and hope we can come up with different models.
I want to make a difference. I strive every day to do that in my job. It's really exciting to know that what I come into work to do has a huge amount of impact in terms of changing the way the science is heading. My aim is to create safe products for everyday use, and I'm passionate that developments in science do not need to use testing on animals. Billions of cosmetics are sold worldwide. It gives me enormous pride to know that I work for a company that has been pioneering non-animal approaches for 30 years. At Unilever, this is what we do. My name is Georgia Reynolds, and I'm a product safety scientist. I work at Unilever's Global Safety and Environmental Assurance Centre. We are pioneering in consumer safety using non-animal approaches and also environmental and sustainability sciences.
Consumer safety is non-negotiable. My name is Julia Fenton, and I'm the head of Unilever's Safety and Environmental Assurance Centre. Working with other organisations worldwide, we have been involved in the development, the evaluation, and then the regulatory acceptance of the non-animal methods that we now use.
When we do a safety assessment of a new ingredient going into a Unilever product, the first thing that we'll concentrate on is what is that ingredient and how are people actually exposed to it. It's essential that safety is robust, and we take that very seriously here at Unilever. My name's Carl Westmoreland, and I'm Director of Science and Technology at SEAC. If we're evaluating a new ingredient for a deodorant, for example, we look at how it behaves on the skin. Clearly, you don't want to use a new product using a new ingredient that's going to cause a skin allergy.
My role is to look at new ways of looking at how we would risk assess skin allergy and immunology, and how we can apply these sort of methods to a risk assessment for a new ingredient.
I've been a toxicologist for over 30 years. Looking back, animal studies were really the only tools that we had to be able to generate data on ingredients and assess their safety. The advent of cell culture methods and being able to develop models on computer screens has radically changed the tools that we can now use to assess product safety. We were also able to stop any animal testing of ingredients several years before the European Union cosmetics testing ban came into place in 2013.
think this ingredient's going to be going into a deodorant of some kind. Is there anything else we need to be thinking about here?
Yeah, so my concern would be if this is a spray, that we're going to have to think about inhalation.
We use simulated use experiments with mannequins who are specially instrumented to allow us to measure the amount of that ingredient that is present at the breathing zone.
And then our mannequin is taking 5 liters of air per minute, and the air...
The science we're using in safety assessment at the moment is really innovative, and that's what I enjoy about my job. The fact that we're using things like computational chemistry in our safety assessments today have progressed due to a combination of different disciplines in this science.
Everybody is a consumer, including myself, and you want to make sure that whenever you use any product that you are always safe. It's not something that you should have to think about. I am really lucky to be able to take our knowledge and our science and be able to travel around the world and talk to scientific communities at conferences and meetings.
Transparency in what we do is critical to the acceptance of the new approaches. We have published over 550 articles on the scientific research that we have done over the past 30 years.
The research that's done by and supported by Unilever is of the highest quality and is internationally respected. It's our hope that the methods and tools that Unilever develop can be used in other areas globally.
So we're going to, again, getting the point here. This is almost just an ad for Unilever, right? So, you know, we always need to think critically about what is the source of the information, as we have already, right? But I like that they talked about presenting these at conferences and publishing them to try and encourage other people to use these methods. That really is the goal of science in terms of trying to get change to happen, is to publish it, make it accessible to other scientists so that they can take it and run with it too. All right, we'll keep talking about the numbers on Friday. So thank you, Five, for coming. And I hope to see more of the people on Zoom in person if you're able to on Friday. But Zoom is always going to be an option. Take care.